Welcome to Developing a Business Plan module of the YouWin Connect program. This module is designed to assist you to learn in simple ways, but very effective ways, how to develop a business plan. In this module, we will learn, first of all, be able to name key considerations when writing a business plan. We'll also learn on how to apply a simple process to writing a business plan effectively. We'll also be able to, at the end of the module, we'll also be able to present a business plan document. Also, as a learning outcome, we'll also know the key considerations when evaluating investment decisions. We will learn common tools and techniques in evaluating investment options. We will know key considerations in business expansion. This module will also culminate in us learning steps in modernizing an existing business and, of course, key considerations in developing new products. In terms of content, we'll learn developing a business plan in session 1. In session 2, we'll look at evaluating investment decision options. And in session 3, we'll look at expansion and how to modernize an existing business. Session 1, developing a business plan. At the end of this session, you'll be able to name key considerations when writing a business plan, apply a simple process to write a business plan, coordinate the various companies, departments, and resources in the process of writing a business plan, and then present a business plan document. In terms of content, there are 5 parts to this module. The first part is an overview of a business plan. The second part is analyzing market and making a marketing plan. Third part is making the operational plan. And the fourth part, making the financial plan. And then finally, part 5, writing the business plan. Part 1. Overview of a business plan. The question to ask at this point is, what is a business plan? For most companies, business plan is not a new term. However, you need to make sure that you understand the term in order for you to know what to do as far as writing a business plan is concerned. For a simple definition, Ernst & Young in the Business Plan Guide in 1993 defined a business plan as simply a written representation of where a company is going, how it will get there, and what it will look like once it arrives there. In other words, the business plan is the roadmap for any business. This is similar to how a pilot wanting to move an airplane from one point to the other files a flight plan that states the route that he will take, the altitude of the flight, and it will also have everything, including the amount of fuel, the need for the journey. Types of business plan. A business plan is divided into 2 main parts. First is a periodical, or what in other parlance is called an annual plan. An annual business plan is that which the company needs to achieve its objectives for the year. This includes sales volume, profits, market share, and growth, which must all be coordinated with one another. Then the tasks and budget for every department are set up for every month or for every quarter, depending on how the company decides to evaluate its own success or otherwise. The second type of business plan is a non-periodical business plan. The non-periodical business plan can be looked at in 2 ways. One, it could be a plan to start up a new business, or it could be a plan for a new investment. Usually, a non-periodical business plan would feature objectives which ranges from 3 to 5 years. It is generally done as a necessity for a company, either at startup or when they need to raise capital or to get a new license. This business plan can also be used as guidance for management in terms of operational directions. Now, let's look at the content of the business plan. The first part of the business plan content usually includes a company's description, a description of the product and services of the company, an analysis of the company, its products, its market, so that the reader can clearly understand the company, the characteristics and the needs of the company's customers, its products, and who its competitors are. The next part of the business plan includes the company's objective, the general strategy and devices, together with concrete functional operations which the company intends to implement to achieve its objectives. The ability of forming this strategy and the thinking of the plan maker is shown in this second part of the business plan. The last part of the business plan is concerned with analyzing the resources needed to implement the business plan. It also contains forecast of financial results which the company plans to achieve. The risk analysis part is used to consider and compare the real facts in relation to the assumptions in the business plan. In summary, the business plan's content can be categorized into 3. First is the company's description, second, analysis, and third is the estimation and evaluation. The important thing is to make sure that in writing the business plan, there's consistency between the 3 parts of the business plan. It's important to note that all of the parts of the business plan are all interconnected as one leads to the other. If you take any part out of the business plan, most likely the company would not be able to achieve its set objective. Although the business plan is divided into parts, for the company to be able to operate effectively, all the interrelated parts must show some level of consistency. It's important to note at this point that the details shown in the business plan is dependent on what the business plan is designed to do and who the reader is. Let's look at the steps in the business plan process. This also dictates how we will study this plan in this module. So firstly, we start with the market. You will agree with me that if there is no market, then we're not in business. So we need to study the market, understand the customer, and then we'll look at who else is competing with us in this market. We'll go ahead to build a marketing plan, and then we would build an operations plan to produce for the market, and then we will build a financial plan, and finally we will go ahead to write a business plan. So let's start by analyzing the market and making the marketing plan. In analyzing the market, the question is, what is the size of the target market? Forecasting market size in the current and in the future will help to identify the potentiality of the market. This will help to decide whether to get into the market or not, and to project what sales volume we will be able to achieve in this market. Suffice to say that it's so possible that the goods or the products that we're thinking of bringing to the market is a matured product, in that there are many people who are providing such products already. The question we would ask ourselves is, what makes us different? Does the market still have the ability to contain this product we're bringing to the market? And will there be people within that market that would still be able to accommodate whatever it is that we bring in, and also be able to provide the necessary patronage for our own products? Second question to ask is, yes, we have a target market, but what's the size of the total market? Can this total market be grown, or are we leaving it, or is it something that is finite and cannot be expanded? For us to be able to determine our target sales volume, we would multiply the market size with the target market share. For example, if the total market size is 1 million persons, and we have targeted to serve just 25% of the market, what that means is that our sales revenue can only be based on 250,000 people, which represents a target market share of 25%. Markets are built to grow or shrink. So the question is, how do we estimate market growth? There are two considerations that we look at when we look at market growth. The first consideration is, how has the market grown in the past? Usually this is expressed in terms of percentages. How much percentage represents the growth in the market over the years? The second thing that influences market growth are environmental factors. First of all, the economy, especially if it's a consumer product. The more disposable income within the economy, the higher the probability of growth for most consumer products. The second thing that affects market growth in terms of environmental factors is technology. In the last few years, a number of developments in the technological terrain has changed the taste and how people want to access markets. So we need to take that into consideration when we're estimating market growth. Legal considerations, that's the law and regulations, also affect it, and of course substitute products. Let's look at customer characteristics. The questions that we would ask ourselves is, who are the customers that we're targeting to buy our products? There are many people involved in the buying process. They can be buyers or they can be users. Sometimes both are combined. For example, when we buy Coca-Cola to drink, we are the buyers and we're the users. But sometimes these two could be different. For example, when we buy notebooks for our children, we are the buyers, the children are the users. So we need to understand who the customers are and be able to make provisions for them and how to reach them. Second thing, you need to ask yourself, what are their characteristics? We may have many kind of customers. For example, a restaurant having several customers such as family customers, office staff customers, VIP customers, etc. Different kinds of customers need different approaches, and we need to be aware of this. Customer characteristics include age, sex, education, occupation, psychology, and culture. And we need to be mindful of this when we are setting strategy for addressing customers. It's important to note here that each type of customer have their varying behaviors. Where, when, and how do they buy the products? How often? How much? Or how many do they buy at each time? Are they price sensitive? Do they easily switch to other products? How do they use the product? How they discard the product? The question of how do they use the product is extremely important, because we might make the product for something else and then the customer uses the product for something else. There are several examples of this. One that readily comes to mind is the battle between use of analgesics for pain killing and the same use for recreational purposes, as it's been very rampant with youths in different parts of Nigeria today. In terms of customer characteristics, something that we should also know is how do customers approach information. What kind of information are they interested in? When? And from what source do they rely on for their information? This would also assist us in knowing how to send information to our would-be customers. For example, anyone interested in targeting the youth, or what it's called the millennial customers today, knows that it's fruitless putting them in hard copies or traditional media. Rather, you should approach them through social media. Having understood the customer, let's take one more step to look at and analyze the competition. It's important to note at this point that strategies built around competition is at best reactive. In that wise, it's important for you, yes, don't ignore the competition, but don't build your strategy around the competition. So the question you ask yourself is, who are our competition? When we analyze competition, suffice to say that we can look at different kinds of competitors. First, you can have direct competition, which is somebody who does the same kind of products and plays in the same market with us. A very good example that readily comes to mind would be Coke and Pepsi. However, we can have other types of competition that are not direct in this wise. You can also have indirect competition. Indirect competition is when the customer uses their budget to do something else. For example, customers decide to do business with replacement products, or using the funds that they have to buy your product or service to do something entirely different. There are some indirect competitors who have very strong influences, and as such would need to be mindful of this and take that into consideration. In order for us to show distinct strengths, we need to compare ourselves or compare our company with its competitors and then bring out the distinct strengths of each one of those companies. The question you should ask yourself when comparing with competition is, what's the interrelation between us and our competitors in the following ways? One, in marketing. How do they distribute their products? What's the pricing? How do they communicate? In production, do they have better equipment than we have? In human resource, are their people better motivated than we are? In financing, do they have better access to finance or capital than we have? Weaknesses or strengths can be justified by the following. One, whether the customers need what we actually consider crucial to them. That is, are we able to provide value to the customers? Whether we're stronger than the competitors on the aspects that we are considering. That is, do we have any comparative advantage over the customer in any of those, over the competitor in any of those areas that we consider ourselves being strong? Remember, the customer should be our focus at all times, but we should be aware of what the competition is doing and where we best provide value to the customer. So, let's look at competitive approaches. There are varying places where we can provide competitive edge against the customer. The question to ask yourself is, in terms of the product, are we more stable than the competitor? Do we provide best service? Do we provide the highest value compared with the money paid? Are we the safest, the quickest, the most advanced in technology, the most convenient, the best design? How impressive is our image? I need to say it here that all of these approaches or competitive approaches can be best decided by the customer, as they are the ones who know what represents value to them. Two customers could experience service in the same environment and have two different experiences as far as that same environment is concerned. I remember the story of two gentlemen from the same organization who went to work in a certain environment and stayed in the same hotel in the space of 1 week from each other. One of them believed that the hotel, the services at the hotel, provided the best value that he had experienced in that region in a long time, while the other thought that that was the worst service he had ever received. So we need to be mindful of all of this and the kind of image that we want to give out to customers each time that we provide service to our customers. So, customer analysis, what does it help us to do? It helps us to set objectives and identify our target sales volumes. The two most common objectives of an enterprise are sales volume or market share and the net earnings, which in other parlance is called profits. The two objectives are, however, not mutually exclusive. A company can work towards both objectives at the same time. However, it should prioritize them. One way to reconcile these two objectives is to identify the target sales volume and the profit index, which will be calculated in the financial plan. If the minimum profit index calculated in the financial forecast seems not achievable, we need to come back and review the whole plan. If there is no other way to increase profits, this plan should then be considered unfeasible. So to calculate the target sales volume, you multiply the target market share with the target market size. All of these are estimates which help us to determine the revenues that come and accrue to the organization. In setting target sales volume, we need to be mindful of the following. That target market share is subjective, although it's based on information from market analysis, but it still remains subjective. The way people collect, interpret and analyze information may vary from one person to the other. So we need to be mindful of this and have the organization discuss. Individuals within the organization discuss with themselves so as to reach an agreement on how to improve the subjectivity while committing everyone to those objectives. For a new investment, subjective factors can play an even bigger role. However, the management of the organization will still need to try and use historical sales and market share to develop the annual marketing plan. This takes us to the realm of the marketing plan. While this is not a marketing management module, it, however, touches on the marketing plan for how to reach the customers that we had analyzed earlier. In this area, there are 4 main activities that would be considered as far as the marketing plan is concerned. First is the product. How does the product look? Second is, how will the price be set? How will the product be distributed? And how will communication be done? This is referred to in marketing management parlance as the 4 P's of marketing. And this is very essential when we're building a marketing plan, as at this point of the business plan, we're able to show that the products that we make, we can talk about the packaging, the sizes, the different offerings that the product has, the price, how it will be distributed, where it can be sold, where it can be bought, and then how we intend to do promotions around it. The marketing plan helps to achieve the business objectives and communicate the competitive approach into specific activities. Imagine that we have analyzed the customer and the customer's characteristics effectively. We have also embarked on a viable and effective marketing campaign. We still need to make provision for things that could go wrong. Sometimes, or most times, like Murphy's Law says, whatever would go wrong, would go wrong. So, at this point in the business plan, we should also take a deep look and make some analysis of risks that could occur, and also look at contingency planning. Sometimes market conditions do not go as planned. Sometimes the marketing activities encounter some level of obstacles. Therefore, we should consider in advance the possible events and prepare contingency plans. This will ensure us to be more proactive and limit risk when accidents happen. Risk analysis includes a forecast of what mishap could possibly occur. Something that could happen is that there's a stronger competitor that enters the market, or government suddenly changes its policy. The story has been said of a company that shared its plan with government and asked government, and government made a promise to impose high tariffs on importation of a certain commodity, only for when the company had made all the investments and was about to launch to the market, government lowered the tariff on the same commodity. What happened after can be a guess between you and I. So, we must prepare a contingency plan which will state what we will do in case the risk that we forecast happens. So, how do we evaluate the criteria of a marketing plan? First, marketing should be consistent so that it can build a competitive approach. A certain shoe manufacturing company communicated in its marketing approach that it cares for Nigerian feet. However, because the company didn't change its services, Nigerian customers suddenly did not feel that they were cared for. What that simply means is that was an empty slogan. So there has to be consistency between what marketing promises and what the company actually does. There's also the need to check the suitability and consistency of marketing coordination with customers' characteristics and competitive situation. Most of the time, manufacturers or producers are disconnected from their customers, and this leads to distrust between the customer and the manufacturer. Finally, you must consider the possibility of achieving the marketing plan's objectives. If the objectives cannot be achieved, the marketing plan needs to be reconsidered. If it still fails, the company needs to reconsider its own objectives. The final thing to consider as far as the marketing plan is concerned is estimated costs. Estimated costs in marketing includes the cost of advertising, the cost of promotions, in case we do buy one, get one free, 20% off, 50% off. All of these come at a cost, and we need to consider it. Selling and distribution expenses. How do we get the goods to the market? What are the incentives that we give to distributors in the case of those of us who use distributors? Research and development costs, that's R&D costs, would need to also factor that in when we are looking at the cost of marketing. And also, in terms of contingency planning, we must make provision for the costs of contingency planning and every other cost that comes to bear. There's a need to calculate contingency plan expenses. These expenses will not be used if there are no incidents. Normally, marketing expenses are calculated as top-down according to a budget identified based on average industry levels or based on competitors. For example, marketing expenses take 10% of turnover. Marketing budget should be taken approximately as 10% of turnover. But this also depends on the level of promotion that needs to be done and also where the company is at in its own life cycle. Specific expenses need to be added up, and we can use market price and experience to do this. This brings us to the end of the part of discussing the marketing plan. By the time we've gone through all of this, we would have everything that we need to put into the marketing plan for our business plan. So now let's look at the portion of making the production and operation plan. In a business plan, after you must have set your objectives, there has to be a link between your production plan and your marketing plan. Remember that when we discussed earlier, we said that the Marketing plan sets the objectives for the business plan. However, the production plan fulfills the objectives that has been set. So there's no point in setting revenue objectives when we don't have the production capacity to meet those objectives. So in terms of making the production and operations plan, the objectives are this. We'll be able to explain the role of the production and operations plan in a business plan. We'll be able to describe the contents of a production and operations plan, describe the process of preparing a production and operation plan, and then we'll be able to explain the basis for decision making in planning for production. In terms of content, we'll look at the roles of the production or operations plan in the business plan, the components of the operations plan, and also the process of operation and production plan making. The question is this. The first question to ask here is, what is the importance of a production plan? A production plan, or an operations plan as it's called in a service provision company, describes how an organization will meet the demand for product established in the sales projection or the sales objectives. The production plan helps us to formalize the marketing plan from the production point of view, and it attempts to answer the following questions. How will the product be made? Which resources will be used? And what would be the cost of production? Generally speaking, the marketing plan is based on market analysis, and it's a subjective determination of the various persons within the management of the company. Therefore, to formalize that marketing plan from the production point of view helps us to examine the feasibility of the plan so that timely adjustments can be made. The production plan will examine if the current capacity is able to meet sales demand, for example, in an existing organization, and if the company can provide products on time for the market to be able to meet the sales objectives. And of course, what will be the action plan and what will the resources needed? I think the next natural thing to do is to look at the content of a production plan. So, a production plan would have the description of products and the production volume. The products are described from a production perspective, and it will include the raw materials to be used, the equipment to be used that are required, the cost of production, what products will be produced, and how many products of each type should be produced by the company to meet its marketing and stocking plan. The production plan would also have the production procedure. How would the products be produced? That is, what's the production process? What's the technology that will be used? The steps or components that will be used, that is, are we going to outsource or are we going to produce in-house? And why are we taking such decisions? The third thing that will be covered in the production plan is equipment and machinery. What's the plan for equipment and machinery? This needs to be provided separately because it influences the decisions on other resources. Equipment and machinery usually requires substantial investments. Therefore, this plan is very important to be able to make our financial projections. The fourth thing to look at are raw materials and other resources. In this section of the production plan, We will look at the demand for using and stocking of raw materials, quality and quantities required, substitute materials in case the original that we need are not available, suppliers of raw materials, what are the terms of those supplies, what's an economic order quantity, what quantity makes it reasonable for us to be able to keep stock, what are the risks involved in the production process and the requirements as far as human resource, such as the number of employees and skills required are concerned. The fifth thing to look at that forms the content of a production plan is the estimate operation costs. How much financial investment is needed for the production process? What's at the cost of the production and what expenses will be run as far as the production is concerned? And of course, the final thing to look that forms the content of the production plan is the competitive advantages. This section describes the company's quality, product price, scale of production, technology, experiences, and the level of flexibility. Let's look at some of the parts that have been discussed above. First, let's look at the production planning process. In terms of production planning process, this covers the product structure. Product structure includes the product's components, the shape, raw material specifications, technical specifications, and everything that you need to be able to bring out the product. And the production process also describes every product in case you are producing several products. The production planning process also takes account the production quantity. How much of each type of product you need to produce. When we look at production quantities, to be sure that we have what it takes to produce what the marketing plan stipulates, we must first of all consider what the current production capacity is. That is, what's the capacity of the equipment, how large is the factory, how many people are there to man the equipment in the factory. All of this would help to determine if the production process still has space for more to accommodate whatever has been spelled out in terms of objectives in the marketing plan. The production planning process also makes provision for competitive advantage that the company adapted. To show consistency with the marketing strategy, the competitive advantage needs to be very clear in the production planning process. Also, all of these factors that have been outlined above, that's the product structure, product quantity, current production capacity, competitive advantages, would influence the production procedures in that whichever one would, for example, if we're adopting an outsourcing model, it affects the amount of space that we need within the organization. Of course, it also has, that would also have a bearing on how quickly we can bring things to the market, and also if we're stocking raw materials or not. Our production procedure is a basis to determine the demand on equipment, machinery, and the factory. And also the demand for raw materials and other resources depend on production procedures and the competitive advantages and equipment as well. The production plan's objective is to help us determine the investment and production expenses that we need, and these calculations are usually based on experience of the people who prepare the production plan. How do we determine production quantity? With different targets of production quantity, the decision for technology and capacity will be different. and this will result in different production procedures and the demand on equipment and machinery. In terms of production quantity, we'll look at the revenue proposed in the marketing plan as well as the stock holding policy. Stock holding policy refers to how much of finished goods we want to keep in order for us to avoid stock out when we produce. So, for example, we have a target of producing 5,000 cartons of a specific product. However, we agree on having a policy of holding 20% of our production capacity in order for us to avoid being out of stock just in case for anything we cannot produce at certain times, so that we do not get our products out of the market. The stock holding policy comes with its own cost, and that needs to be taken into account whenever we are calculating production costs. So, how do we determine a production procedure? Typically, decisions to be made when deciding on a production procedure include: which process are we using? Manual? Automated? Are we producing in-house? Or are we outsourcing? If we're outsourcing, are we outsourcing the whole product, or are we outsourcing parts of the product? And usually, what assists in being able to make this decision in order for us to be able to have competitive advantage are the following. One, state-of-the-art technology. What technology are we using? Does somebody else have better technology than we do? Can the person handle more volume than we can? Can that person produce cheaper than we can? Of course, when we consider all of this, it helps us to take a decision if we want to produce in-house or if we want to outsource. Cost of production. Are we able to produce competitively? Are there people who are producing cheaper for the same quality or better? What's the quality of the production? Are we better at some part of the production process? Or is somebody else better than us in some other parts? So can we give out some parts of it and then keep the ones that we are better at? What kind of people do we have? What expertise do we have in-house to produce? These are the basis for us to make decisions in order for us to be able to work best with our competitive advantage. Let's take a look at typical decisions that we take for machinery and equipment. One very common decision to take is, do we buy new equipment or do we use existing ones? This is a decision that comes up from time to time, especially when the demand for our products increase and the capacity that we have seems to have been maximized, or we feel that we do not have enough capacity on the machine to be able to produce for the market. So the question is, do we buy new equipment? Do we use existing ones and open more production shifts? Which equipment should we buy if we're buying a new one? A typical question that always comes to mind at this point is, if you have a demand twice what you currently produce, and you have a situation where there's an opportunity to buy an equipment that would make exactly twice that amount, should you invest in that equipment, or should you buy one that will be that have bigger capacity, thereby making provision for expansion later. Where would you site your factory? What's the location? What's the layout of the factory in terms of the equipment that you will put in there? Basis for decision making in this wise will include the capacity requirements plan. How are you going to expand? What's the ramp up plan that you have for expanding your capacity? What's the current capacity you have? Have you maxed out the number of shifts that you can do on the certain machine that you already have? And what's your production procedure and plan? After moving away from machinery and equipment, the next typical thing to look at is raw materials and other resources. What sorts of decisions do we make here? Where do we get the best quality for our raw materials? Who will supply them? What kind of stock levels are we going to keep? Now, talking in terms of raw material stock or inventory, the question is, what mode of inventory management do you want to adapt? Do you want to do just in time? Do you want to do economic order? Do you want to hold minimum level of stock? Now, this all depends on the policies of the organization and what you have decided to do as far as holding on to stock is concerned. Don't forget that holding stock, whether be it finished goods stock or raw material stock, all of these come with a cost, and that cost must be taken into account when this decision is being made. How many workers are needed? What are the skills and qualification requirements? Do you want to buy an equipment which costs you so much, and then you have an untrained person man the equipment, which could be a risk to that equipment? This reminds me the story of a gentleman who bought a Rolls Royce Phantom, and gave it to somebody who he pays 50,000 naira to as a driver. Of course, you know what will happen to that car. So, what's the requirement? What's the qualification? These are all the things, the kind of skills that are required in order for you to be able to get the best of the equipment that you have spent a lot of money on. So, what are the bases for decision making? Competitive advantage. Where do you best have an advantage over your competition in terms of delivery terms from your suppliers or would-be suppliers? What are the terms of payment? Are they flexible with payment? Are they very rigid? Are they expensive? Are they just provide value for the amount of money that you've invested? What's the cost of your stock? What are the characteristics of the stock? Do you need to spend a lot to stock them? Okay, so these are all considerations that you give when you're making the decision for raw materials and other resources. Of course, what's your production plan? And does the production plan support the stock plan that you have? So, how do you determine the cost of investment when you talk in terms of the production plan? The production plan provides information for us to be able to calculate investment expenses in the following areas: land and infrastructure. That are we buying or are we renting? All of these costs will go into the investment, expected investment costs when we get to the financial planning stage. What's the infrastructure that is needed? Electricity, water, sewage treatment, internal roads, fences, and all of that. All of this are important for us to take into account their costs so that we can be able to estimate the investments that we require in the financial plan. Office and factory, what's the design? What are the construction expenses, working capital, required stock levels of raw materials, working group progress, finished goods, and all of this, the cost of this all go into what would make provision for in the financial plan. In terms terms of production costs, we can look at production costs plainly from two main directions. The structure of production costs are either fixed or they're variable. Variable costs include the cost of materials, talking in terms of raw materials now, the cost of raw materials, labor that is directly related to the production process, and other production costs. Fixed includes general production expenses and indirect labor costs, and of course the depreciation, the cost of depreciation on the equipment. In closing up the discussion on production planning, a few things that we need to note and be aware of. When writing a production plan in a business plan, we need to pay attention to two main issues. First, you have to be clear who the target readers of the business plan will be and what's their motivation. Now, if their motivation is simply for investment evaluation, you want to be careful the kind of information that you put in the production plan. If the motivation is that of working with you to either expand or make the production better, then you might need to give a little bit more detail than if it's just for an investment evaluation. Secondly, information in the production plan should be convincing, but be careful not to provide information on corporate secrets. It's important for you to give only the information that is required and not too much information. A business plan is prepared to plan a company's future activities and strategies. The target readers could be the board, so the production plan should present details of alternatives, analysis of each alternative, and explanations of rationale for choosing the one that we've chosen. And if it's as outsiders, they should be presented with information which can convince the reader of the feasibility of the decision and how profitable and within the company's ability. If the business plan is for starting up a new business, information on costs of equipment, raw material, labor must be presented clearly in the production plan. This information will be the basis of financial calculations. And lastly, companies who make a plan to expand production scale should be careful to assess current production capacity and capacity of their existing equipment. Up to now, we've looked at the marketing plan. We've also looked at the production plan. And we've seen the interrelationship between the two components as we've discussed, being that the marketing plan gives the objective and the production plan produces for the marketing objectives. Now, the next part that we're going to look at is making the financial plan. The two components that we have looked at, the marketing and the production plan, are all make input into the financial plan, while the marketing plan gives both revenue and cost inputs, revenue in terms of the objective, the sales objective of the organization, cost inputs in terms of the marketing costs and contingency costs. The production plan gives us the cost implications of all the production activities, be it equipment, infrastructure, and the production costs. All of this become inputs into the financial plan. So, to discuss the financial plan, we have the following objectives. The part on making the financial plan helps us to explain the role of the financial department in business planning, describe contents of a financial plan, describe the steps of the financial projection process, and helps us to explain the financial factors which need to be considered before we make any investment decision. In terms of content, we'll look at the role of financial projections, content of financial plan, and process of preparing a financial plan. So, let's look at the role of a financial plan. A financial feasibility has two broad sides. First, it demonstrates the viability of the project in terms of how profitable it is, the kind of return that we get from the investment, ability to repay debt in order to get financing. The second side is that it proves that this project is feasible with a financial index in the financial projection. This index will be mentioned more clearly in the next discussions. When we put investment ideas into practical figures, setting the expected receipts and expenses of the project is one of the things that shows that those projects are viable. The simplest way to control project implementation is to make a comparison of real revenues or expenses and forecasted revenues and expenses in the financial projections. So, what are the contents of a financial plan? There are three main components or contents in the financial plan. First is summary of historical financials. So this will include the growth of turnover, profitability, property balance for at least 2 years, and other attached illustrated data. This section of the business plan should not be over 2 pages long. So it gives how historically the company's revenues have grown over the number of years that is in view. This section aims to demonstrate the company's past performance and its ability to support the new project to potential investors. This section is not applicable for financial projections of new ventures because new ventures means that there is no historical record. Now, when you have written and shown the summary of historical financials, you then need to present the summary of forecasted figures. The forecasted financials should not be over 3 pages long. It explains investment items and their financial requirements. So it tells us what funds are required and what the funds will be used for. It will present key assumptions written in the financial projections. It would also show estimated results based on index, profitability, quick payable, long-term solvency, the sensibility of the project to the changes in the market, and the financial outlook of the project. The next thing to have in the financial plan are all the detailed calculations. However, this is not presented as part of the business plan. It's attached as appendices at the back of the business plan so that we do not bore our readers. Now let's look at the process of developing a financial plan. Financial projections can be related to a cycle. It indeed actually is a cycle. The financial projection results are key content of a financial plan. In fact, people usually make the financial projection before writing the financial plan. Let's see why the financial projection is a cycle. The first data needed for the financial projection are forecasted expenses. Such expenses are as the cost of sales, what we need to start the investment, investment costs, the sources of the financing where they're coming from, and then that is put into use, and then it generates sales projections, and the sales projections, sales revenues rather, generates sales revenues, and the sales revenues of course have associated costs with it. When you mix the investment, add the sales revenue to it, and take out the costs, it brings you to the point where you have results of financial projection. Now, if you have the results of the financial projections, it can either show that the investment is profitable and there's some level of solvency with it. If it is, then you can take a decision if you should invest or not. And when you do that, you go back to the beginning, and that's how it becomes a cycle. For emphasis sake, please note that project size will determine the turnover, the selling costs, and other expenses. Turnover and other expenses will determine the profitability and if the project will be solvent or not. Considering all that, the investors will decide to or not to invest. If the profitability or solvency are at risk levels, you should adjust the project size, increase turnover, or reduce expenses. If the project cannot be adjusted, the project then is not feasible. Okay, so where do we get input data for the financial projections from? 1. Project expenses. We get this from the person managing the project or the owner of the project about the size. This is based on opinions of sales and operations department. Financial sources, estimation of the financial department. They will be able to tell where the financing will come from and what kind of mix the financing would be. Turnover will be forecast of the sales department. Production costs, data collected by the financial department for current products, or data from trial results of the operational department for new ventures. Sales and marketing expenses, data collected by the financial department for new ventures. Sales expenses are estimated by the sales department. Now let's look at the process of developing a financial plan. A critical part of the financial plan are assumptions. Because we're dealing with projections, assumptions are extremely critical for this process. The question will be, why are assumptions needed? The financial projection is made for a period of 3 to 5 years. However, at the time of making the projections, the necessary information and data are generally not sufficient. Therefore, assumptions are needed. The assumptions are based on historical data, experience, and estimates. Accuracy of assumptions will determine the quality of the forecast. Therefore, one needs to be very careful when making assumptions, because whatever you put in is what you get out of it. If you prepare your forecast with unrealistic assumptions, the forecasts themselves will be very unrealistic. Business characteristics influence the assumptions. Therefore, there are no standards for making assumptions. It all depends on what you want to achieve and what the conditions in the environment are at the time you're making the assumptions, and what you forecast that the conditions will be in 3 to 5 years that you're making the plan for. However, these assumptions can be divided into 4 groups. These are financial structure, percentage of raw materials related to production cost, working capital needs, and allowed number of debt dates, talking in terms of how much you can be owed and how much you're allowed to owe by your suppliers. Management expenses, everything that has to do with the expenses that relates to managing the enterprise. And of course, credit conditions, including bank interest rates. In terms of financial considerations, two things are very, very critical. First is the financing structure, and two is your investment decision. So let's look at financing structure first. In terms of financing structure, there are two things that are also very, very important. And these are, one, financial sources. Where are we going to get the financing, both to start a venture and to run that venture from? And otherwise, yes, where we're getting it from, the other leg of it is what percentage of each of the sources that we're talking about. Usually, sources of capital are either from owners or shareholders, retained earnings for existing businesses. When we say retained earnings, we mean that the profits that has come from the venture as it goes along as a going concern, the cash from it we can retain to put back into the business. Other sources of capital could be finance lease, loan from bank and other financial organizations, and risk investment funds. When we now talk in terms of sources of capital, we can divide them into two. You can have debt or you can have equity. Whichever way we look at it, it's a capital that is owned by the owners of the company, or capital that you get as debt from other sources. You can categorize into debt or equity. In terms of percentages of each source, the higher the percentage of owner's capital, the higher the risk for the lenders. Therefore, banks generally fix a maximum lending rate about 70% of the investment costs. So what bankers typically do is allow the owners of the business to have a skin in the game by pegging whatever the contributions that the owners will bring to about 30%. If the company raises capital from shareholders, the project owner will generally want to be the majority shareholder in order to take the management position. So there are a lot of things that you need to look at as a basis for consideration. So, in determining if a project would get capital from debt or equity, let's look at a few things that we can consider. First is what we're using the capital for. You use long-term sources of capital for fixed assets, and especially long-term fixed assets. And then you use short-term sources for working capital. So you can take a quick loan from the bank to finance working capital and also to meet some short-term needs. If you use capital from short-term sources for long-term projects, the pressures from debt repayment will increase, and that would not augur well for the managers of the enterprise. The cost of capital in terms of interest rates and dividend payouts also are basis for consideration in determining the percentage of capital from any of the sources that we had mentioned earlier. The longer lending time, the higher interest and the higher the risk. The cost of capital is the interest. Interest costs are usually lower than cost of shares. Because as shareholders take greater risk, they require greater return on their investments. In case the company goes bankrupt, shareholders are refunded only after all other lenders are refunded. And there's been an age-long debate on which is more expensive. Is it debt or is it equity? To further the debate, a lot of people seem to think equity is cheaper than debt. However, in terms of management, equity is a lot easier to manage than debt. But debt at the end of the day might actually be cheaper depending on the consideration that is being given. But this is not a finance class, so we will not dwell too much on that. The cost of capital is the interest. Interest costs are usually lower than cost of share because as shareholders take greater risk, they require greater return on investment. In case the company goes bankrupt, shareholders are refunded only after other lenders are refunded. The other consideration that we look at is payback period. The payback period is defined as the time required to repay all of the invested funds from the money generated by the project. This is one of the most common appraisal techniques. When using this technique, the best project is the one with the shortest payback. So, let's look at how we can improve financial projections. In improving financial projections, there are two possible solutions. Solutions can be from internal resources, and solutions could come from market conditions. What we usually advocate is that to improve financial projections, let's look at the things that we have control over first. So let's consider things from internal resources. So we can actually adjust investment scope, which reduces the amount of money that would be invested in the project. We can change the size of inventory and decide not to keep as much as we would have kept if we were looking at an optimistic position. Also, you can also look at costs in terms of production costs, also in terms of cost of managing the enterprise, and see if there are things that we can bring down so that financial projections will look better. Solutions from the market can provide information to make an optimistic financial forecast, but they are not easy to implement. For example, we can increase sales or reduce cost of sales. If you are increasing sales, you must do that in a realistic way that would be in tandem with what the market can take. There's a warning that we must not play with numbers. In other words, ensure that whatever it is that we do in terms of improving projections must be within realistic levels. If after adjustment the forecasted figures, the results of the forecasted figures are still looking bad, then it's generally not allowed to invest, not advisable rather to invest. Having considered the three components of marketing plan, operations plan, and financial plan, it's now time to sit down and put all of this together in a business plan. Note that, as we had mentioned from the beginning, all of the different components all come together to give us the results because they are interrelated with one. So, let's look at writing the business plan. The objectives of this is for us to be able to list the key factors that need to be considered when writing a business plan, and of course be able to describe the steps to write the business plan. In terms of content, we'll be able to note the considerations in business plan writing, and then also steps in business plan writing. There are 4 possibilities when we're writing a business plan, and these possibilities derive from what we are writing and whom we are writing for. And this gives rise to 4 types of business plans. The type 1 is we are writing business plan for a new business and we want to raise capital. The considerations for this is that we must identify and evaluate the difficulties which may occur when establishing this new venture. We must conduct a detailed analysis of the business activities, highlight the distinctive strengths, weaknesses, and challenges that may occur in order to develop solutions. We would need to highlight the feasibility of the venture, show total of capital requirements and sums needed at every stage of the venture, highlight assumptions and key variables that may affect the base scenario. And then we summarize and present nature of business ideas under a logical structure, allowing potential investors or counterparts to understand and evaluate the feasibility of the venture. When you're writing a new business plan for potential investors or for the bank, you must be ready to show the investment returns and then show the full requirement in terms of capital for the project. The type 2, starting business and you're writing for in-house people, for management, your colleagues, and also for the owners of the business. The content in this type is the same as the type 1. However, there's no need to pay attention to convincing the readers about the company's success because it's something that is already known to all of you. Writers need to concentrate on information, specific solutions for the common activities of the company. So in this, you show the objectives, business strategy, and the taxes. Of course, you will give detailed technology and production process and the description of the production process when you're writing this. You write the necessary resources and the timelines that you need. And of course, in the financial plan, you will show the risk evaluation. You will also show scenario analysis and paint the best case, worst case, and the realistic scenarios when you are considering the financial aspects of this venture. Type 3, it's an expansion business plan. You want to expand the investment and you want to raise capital. You're writing for banks, shareholders, and potential investors. This should present clear turnover, current earnings, receivables, and why the company needs extra support. It should highlight the feasibility of the venture, show the total capital requirements and needs at every stage of the venture. Needs to emphasize which factors will enable the company to succeed. And of course, it needs to anticipate the potential risks, analyze and prepare for potential obstacles, or identify the level of risk tolerance of the company. Type 4, expansion investment, and you're writing to in-house people. The content is same as 3, but it's a lot more specific, concentrating on main issues like current difficulties of the company and the solutions to them. A business plan should help venture managers anticipate difficulties or risks which they will meet and make right and on-time decisions in implementing the process. This plan should show very detailed technology, selective production process, and the marketing strategy. So, when writing a business plan, how should the outlook be? Let's look at suggested outlines. You have an overview, which some people call executive summary, which should give you the full view in not more than 2 pages of what the business plan is about. The venture, the market, the expected returns, and what you intend to do. And then you have the other part of the business plan. So you have executive summary, you have an introduction of the company, the people who are managing it, and the governance structure, that is the board of the company. Then you have products and your service description, you have your market analysis, you have a marketing plan, and then you have your financial plan, and you can put every other thing as appendices. Let's look at the steps in writing a business plan. Step 1, preparation. This includes shaping of needs, shaping your ideas, determining your objectives and your action plan, and then your necessary resources. So this is the point that you prepare all of that and you start to shape your ideas around the venture that you're going into. Step 2, information collection. It's at this point that you make a note of the information requirements and the way you want to collect every type of information. You determine the level of accuracy you require, because this will have a strong influence on the amount of time that is necessary and the cost and the way to collect the information. Step 3, draft. This includes information collection and analysis, building strategy and action plan, forecast, and collection of resource requirements, as well as risk analysis. It's at this point that you put your draft together on the way the business plan will eventually look. Step 4, adjustments. Your draft is presented to either your board or consultants to get their contributions. These contributions should be considered carefully in order to make any necessary adjustments. This process may be repeated as needed so that the business plan would have the required accuracy. Step 5, approval. A business plan writer will complete the plan and then submit it to the company's management for approval. The business plan writing process is completed when management accepts its quality and agrees to it. Now the question is, should the business plan be written in-house or should it be outsourced? Are we going to hire a consultant or are we going to write ourselves? There are many advantages and disadvantages for both options, either to write in-house or to hire a consultant. Now, the generally accepted mode is to have a combination of both, because the business plan owner understands the business or the venture that he wants to go into much better than a consultant would. However, the business plan owner might not have the requisite knowledge and ability to write a professional business plan. So he needs a consultant to do that. So we'll look at this, even though it's more expensive to hire a consultant, but with the business plan owner doing some level of the work, it's easier for the process to be managed and might at the end of the day be a bit cheaper for them to hire a consultant just to help in finalizing the plan and making it more professional. Some important things to note. First, you need to identify what the purpose of the business plan is and who the readers are. This would help to tailor the way or the content of the business plan in order for it to be acceptable to whichever reader it's meant for. Usually, tasks are more difficult at the earlier stage, from the shaping of ideas to the data collection to write the business plan. So when writing, you should begin by the easy steps, like the company description, its product and services. Those ones come in a lot easier, and it's better to start with that. If you meet difficult issues and cannot solve them immediately, you need to make assumptions or postpone writing them, and then you can come back to them when things are a lot clearer. Arranging the presentation of content logically helps the reader to better understand the plan. You should write clearly and shortly, make references, and having detailed and accurate index, list of tables, pictures where necessary. But don't make the business plan a junkyard. The business plan has to be objective and accurate regarding the company's weaknesses. It should show how the company will deal with these weaknesses. The writing style and structure must be clear and logical. Avoid writing long sentences and using difficult terms. A business plan should be printed on good quality paper, and it should also be 20 to 30 pages long, maximum 30 pages. This is not including the appendices. Every other detail could be put in the appendices, but the size of the business plan should not be more than 30 pages. In closing this session, I'll leave with this word. No one plans to fail. They fail because of having no plan. It's important for every business to develop a business plan in order for them to have a roadmap to run the businesses. In the next session, we'll start by looking at what investment projects are and how to evaluate investment decisions. We have come to the end of the session on developing a business plan.